I know I'm missing it. I mean, I'm getting out in the great outdoors, but the very local great outdoors is all that's available. It would be nice to go a bit further afield eventually. Um, well, tonight we are very fortunate to have two speakers, David White and Rob Jaques, both of whom are with the BTO, the British Trust for Ornithology. They both work in particular in connection with the Garden BirdWatch scheme, and I'm sure that some of you, like I do, contribute statistics to the Garden BirdWatch. Rob has been in his role for just over 2 years and David for 18 months. They're both Garden BirdWatch supporter development organisers. In this evening's talk, they're going to cover some of the data from the survey over the past 25 years to tell us something about significant increases in species, significant declines, and so on. And they're also going to tell us about some of the additional survey results that Garden BirdWatch has produced into garden wildlife disease, and two special surveys, the Big Garden Beak Watch and the Abnormal Plumage Survey. So I know I'm very much looking forward to tonight's talk. Jeff has asked me to say that questions should go in the Q&A, please, not in the chat, in the Q&A if possible. And as usual, you're encouraged to contribute, as and when the questions occur to you during the talk, so that Jeff's got a chance to organise them into some kind of order while things are going on. All right, over to you, David and Rob.
Okay, thank you very much, Helen. Good evening, everybody. So my name's David. I'm one of the Garden BirdWatch supporter development officers and also have my colleague Rob here as well. So I'm going to be doing most of the talking this evening. Rob will be around to answer some questions at the end. So I had a very, very good introduction. So hopefully you know what you're going to get. And I'm just going to start sharing my screen and to make a start. And before I start properly, I'd just like to say it's really, really nice to see so many people listening in, looking at the numbers, the amount of people on a very, very cold evening in February. We really do appreciate it. Believe it's going to be -9 here in Norfolk tomorrow evening. So that's something that'll be a treat for us and not necessarily a treat for the garden birds. But anyway, so without any further ado, I'll begin. So just tell you, hang on, here we go. So what is Garden BirdWatch? So BTO Garden BirdWatch. So BTO Garden BirdWatch has been running for over 25 years. It started on the 1st of January 1995. So almost 20,000 people take part in the survey now. And last year, 2020, there were 330,000 wildlife submissions to the survey over the course of the year. So I'll talk more about that later on. But so in order to take part in Garden BirdWatch, people submit weekly maximum counts of the birds and other wildlife in their garden. Again, go into methodology a bit more in a minute. So, and what we also do when people sign up to Garden BirdWatch is ask them about their gardens, how big their gardens are, what provisions they have for wildlife. Of course, gardens come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes. Even if you have a very, very small one, to attract some wildlife, and if you're unlucky not to have a garden, then you will still see some wildlife, and there are things that you can do. So I will move on, and I thought what I'd do is start off with a bit of local data for you. So I don't know how well you can see these blobs, but these blobs represent the people who take part in Garden BirdWatch in northern England, so specifically more Yorkshire and Humberside anyway. So, and the size of the blobs is supposed to represent the amount of people that take part in the survey in those areas. So West Yorkshire here, the pale green blob, quite a lot of people. North Yorkshire slightly lower. South Yorkshire again quite large. So the vast majority of Garden BirdWatchers in Yorkshire and Humberside in West Yorkshire, then North Yorkshire, then South Yorkshire, just in case you're wondering. And then you've got East Riding there, you've got York, Northallerton, and then Kingston upon Hull there, if you're wondering which the other ones were. And in terms of what do people see when they take part in Garden Birdwatch, so as I've already hinted, I mean, people submit counts of their garden bird numbers up to weekly. So this pie chart here just shows roughly the proportion of different species that are reported. I'll just pick out a few: blue tit, great tit, coal tit, chaffinch, greenfinch, dunnock, robin, species you'd expect from a garden survey that feature the most, which is perhaps not surprising. And then you've also got here great spotted woodpecker, and then domestic cat as well, which some of you I'm sure will own cats. And then you've got a variety of different, you've got a little butterfly segment there as well. So I should say this data is specifically from North Yorkshire. I wasn't quite sure whether to include data from North Yorkshire or West Yorkshire, but I've gone for North Yorkshire. So that's just where it comes from. So talking about this garden birdwatch methodology, it's very important at this point just to talk about the RSPB's Big Garden Birdwatch, because there are quite a lot of similarities between the two surveys. I'm sure that most of you, or many of you, took part in the RSPB Big Garden Birdwatch last weekend. So the RSPB Big Garden Birdwatch has been taking place for slightly longer than BTO Garden Birdwatch. The RSPB survey started back in 1979, and since then it's been taking place each year over the last weekend in January. And the fundamental aim of it is to submit your counts of the highest number of each species that you see over the course of an hour during that weekend. So for example, if you did your Big Garden Birdwatch count last weekend and you were lucky enough to see this group of 6 long-tailed tits on your feeder, and that's the highest count that you saw at one time, that would be your results to the Big Garden Birdwatch. So in essence, Garden Birdwatch methodology is very similar in that we ask people to submit their highest count of the species that they see at one time, whereas the key difference is the RSPB survey only takes place once a year, but Garden Birdwatch people can take part in up to weekly throughout the year. And by submitting counts weekly, it means that you get a slightly more broader indication of garden bird numbers, how they change throughout the year. And I'll touch on that as we go along through the talk, and how different species come to prominence at different times of year. So those are the key differences really between the RSPB survey and BTO Garden Birdwatch. So I should say as well that until recently, BTO Garden Birdwatch, you had to pay £17 to take part in it. It's actually, you can actually now sign up for free. So the RSPB's Big Garden Birdwatch has always been free, but you can also now sign up to BTO Garden Birdwatch for free if you so wish. And I'll tell you more about that at the end of the talk. So it was a big year for us last year, to 2020, the 25th anniversary of BTO Garden Birdwatch. So obviously, given the COVID restrictions, we couldn't celebrate it the way we wanted to, but that's been the story of everybody's life for the last year, really, hasn't it, unfortunately? But we did get some really interesting results. So here we have the Garden Birdwatch rankings for the last 25 years. So what I thought I'd do is pick out a few species, and then I will go into some of them in more detail in the next section of the talk. So number 1 in the Garden Birdwatch ranking is the blue tit, and it was the same 25 years ago. But then you've also had some quite significant changes in ranking. So wood pigeon has actually gone up 10 places. So the area shared in, I'll get my words out in a minute. The areas shaded in green are species that have increased. So that's a 10 place increase in rankings. Goldfinch has increased 12 places. But sadly, the ones that are shaded in red are the species that have dropped in rankings, such as house sparrow, starling, greenfinch, and song thrush, which is a shame. I mean, it's certain species are increasing and declining. And now what I'll do is go on to a few species and talk about why their rankings have changed, some of the theories as to why that's happened. So the species I'm actually going to start off with is the song thrush. So song thrush is hopefully quite a familiar bird to most of you. So a very charismatic bird that at this time of year, on a nice and sunny day, you'll hear singing very loudly. If you're not familiar with the song of the song thrush, it repeats the phrase that it says 3 or 4 times over. It's a very loud song. It's a very clear song, and is usually delivered from the top of an exposed perch. So see song thrushes when they're singing, which is a bit different to some species that tend to sing in cover. There are quite a few of them, as you probably know. So sadly, song thrush has dropped by 8 places in the last 25 years in the Garden Birdwatch rankings. And just to draw another parallel with the RSPB's Garden Birdwatch, song thrush again has really dropped in rankings in that survey as well since the beginning of that survey as well. So it's a bit of a concern that song thrush numbers have declined so much. I mean, we don't fully understand why they've declined. There are a couple of possible reasons. So firstly, I mean, we're getting more and more dry summers in most of Britain now, which is impacting the invertebrates, the amount of invertebrates that species like song thrush can feed on, such as snails and worms and other invertebrates, because it's been so dry. Secondly, this seems to have an adverse effect on their mortality as juveniles. So fewer song thrushes are now actually surviving through to adulthood. Whether that's related to the availability of food or something else, we're not sure. But unfortunately, fewer birds are coming into maturity, so to speak, which is worrying. And another possible factor that's causing the drop of song thrushes in gardens is competition from other species, such as blackbird, for example, slightly larger. And as you probably know about blackbirds, they're very, very territorial birds. So before I move on, it's worth noting that song thrush numbers are actually doing okay in the wider countryside at the moment, but in gardens especially, the numbers are dropping. So it is a concern. So the next, and then, so I'm going to show you a few of these graphs, but these in essence show the declines from recent years. So the grayer lines are the older data, and the blue line would be 2019, and the red line's 2020. So you can see that their counts have dropped over the last couple of years. And what these graphs also show you is when you're most likely to encounter this species in your garden over the course of the year. So song thrush, mostly to be seen in highest numbers April, May and June during the breeding season. During the autumn, numbers tend to tail off as they feed off in the surrounding countryside on berries and natural food. But at this time of year, that's when you tend to see your highest counts of song thrush. So the species to talk about is the greenfinch, and I'm going to go into quite a lot of detail about greenfinch and also a few other species while I talk about about greenfinch, because there's quite a lot of links to the decline of this species and other species. So most of you will know that greenfinches have sadly been affected by a disease called trichomoniasis in recent years. So if you're not familiar with this disease, it first affected greenfinches around 15 years ago and has caused quite a lot of issues with the greenfinch population. They've actually declined by up to 2/3 in some gardens. They've dropped by 7 places in the Garden Birdwatch rankings during that time. And it really does seem to affect them quite badly. So to tell you a bit more about trichomoniasis, there are different strains of it, which I'll go into more when I'm talking about a different species. But the finch trichomoniasis that affects greenfinches and other species as well tends to be transmitted at bird feeding stations. So unfortunately, what happens is affected birds, their saliva gets onto bird feeders, and since finches are quite sociable birds, that's how the disease is transmitted, and it gets passed on to other greenfinches and to other finches as well. So what you don't want to see is a greenfinch with trichomoniasis on your feeder. So this is what a bird with trichomoniasis looks like. Apologies, it's not the nicest of picture, but this shows you what to look out for anyway. So birds with trichomoniasis are very, very fluffed up, lethargic, and just generally quite docile and find it difficult to swallow. So it's really quite a distressing thing to see. trichomoniasis. So before I move on to another species, or a couple of other species that have been affected by it briefly, I'm just going to say that one of the most effective ways of preventing trichomoniasis in your garden, or spread of any disease for that matter, is to clean your bird feeders regularly. So to every couple of weeks or so, take your feeders down, clean them with hot water, or even a mild bleach solution a week bleach solution, I should say, and then just give them a quick clean and disinfect and put them back up. That's a great way of preventing disease from spreading. Alternatively, you can only put as much food in your feeder as you think the birds are going to eat, so there's no wastage and there's no food that will go off. And also you can move your bird feeders around regularly just to try and prevent birds using the same feeders and birds congregating on the feeder if you're worried about trichomoniasis getting spread around. So, and ultimately the most effective way of trying to prevent trichomoniasis from spreading in your garden is to stop feeding the birds in your garden completely. So if for example you suddenly start seeing several green finches or goldfinches or chaffinches that look affected by trichomoniasis, the best thing to do is just to stop feeding the birds completely. Now, we appreciate that, especially at this time of year when it's cold and snowy, it's not the easiest thing to do, but it tends to be the most effective way of preventing these diseases from spreading further. So if you do see a little outbreak in your garden, just stop feeding the birds in your garden, and then after a couple of weeks' time, hopefully it will improve and you can start feeding again. That seems to be the most effective way. So there are a couple of strategies for you, but I mean, I think cleaning feeders is probably the most important. I've recently put up more feeders in my garden. I clean them every 2 weeks. I have a little note in my calendar to do it. It doesn't take very long, and it does definitely help to prevent diseases from spreading in your garden. So while I'm talking about greenfinch, I'll show you one of these graphs again, just show their gradual decline in recent years. So their count data historically just going further and further down, and the blue line and the red line the most recent years. So as you can see, the count data over the last couple of years has just gradually been decreasing. Mainly this is due to trichomoniasis. I mean, they do seem to be showing signs of recovery in some areas, but ultimately that disease is still there. So just be vigilant towards it, and because we don't want to lose our greenfinch. I mean, it's really sad that until the mid-90s, so it's the mid-2000s, sorry, when trichomoniasis started affecting greenfinches, they're actually doing really, really well. And trichomoniasis, if you will, almost came out of the blue and started affecting the population. So, and we don't want to lose them in gardens because they're a very charismatic bird. So talking about trichomoniasis, in a way, it makes sense to talk about collared dove as well, because it's thought that originally trichomoniasis, the strain of trichomoniasis that finches have, actually did come indirectly from another strain that affected dove species, so pigeons and doves. So unfortunately, species like collared doves can also get affected by trichomoniasis. So it's a different strain, so it doesn't transmit directly, but it seems that there may well have been a way indirectly that it got passed down, which is a bit of a worry. So, and as you probably gather from what I've already said about greenfinch, so collared dove numbers have also dropped in recent years, possibly due to trichomoniasis. But before I show you the graph about collared dove, I think it's quite important just to say that, I mean, they're still a very, very numerous bird in gardens. They're a real success story, that just in case you didn't know, so collared doves are actually a recent colonizer to Britain, relatively speaking. They only bred in Britain for the first time in 1955, which relative to other species in Britain is very much a newcomer. And they've really, really done well, but there certainly seems to be a bit of a downturn in their numbers in recent years. Whether it's entirely to do with trichomoniasis, we're not sure. But as you can see, again, you've got the more historical data here going down, and then the blue and red lines, the most recent years. Count data is steadily dropping. So there may well be other reasons why collared doves are declining, such as possibly competition from other species such as wood pigeon, and a couple of other possibilities, but collared doves have been dropping, and it's possibly linked to trichomoniasis as well. Sadly, another species that does get affected by trichomoniasis is the chaffinch. So it's a bit of a concern, really, that chaffinch numbers in Britain, especially in England, have really dropped recently, and there's been a sharp decline in numbers, especially in England, since 2008, which isn't that long ago. But chaffinch numbers are really dropping in England. They're doing better in Scotland and Wales, but for some reason in England they are declining. So we know that they do get affected by trichomoniasis and a couple of other diseases. It may not be the full story of why they're declining, but again, if you see chaffinches with trichomoniasis, it's well worth giving your feeders a clean. Or indeed, if you see chaffinches affected by this disease as well, which is actually quite common as well. So this is Fringilla papillomavirus. It's got a bit of a mouthful of a name, which I don't expect you all to remember, but it's otherwise known as bumblefoot or clubfoot in chaffinches. So here we have a female chaffinch with it, and as you can see, it's got this unsightly growth on its feet, which means that it struggles to get around a bit. So it doesn't affect the birds too much, but obviously it does impair their movement, which means that they are unfortunately more at risk from predation. So one to look out for with chaffinch. So this also affects bullfinch as well, but chaffinch is mostly affected by that disease and also trichomoniasis. So again, if you do see a chaffinch with this disease in your garden, well worth taking your feeders down, giving them a bit of a clean. And if you start seeing the birds, seeing more and more birds with this horrible thing on their feet, then just take your feeders down and stop feeding for a couple of weeks. I know I sound like a broken record, but it is the best way of preventing these diseases from spreading. And just before I move on and talk about slightly happier things, while I'm talking about wildlife disease, I thought I'd just show you one other one to look out for just before I move on to slightly happier things. So this is avian pox. It's slightly different, that it affects a slightly different range of species, mainly dunnocks and great tits like this bird here. It does get transmitted mainly by insect bites, but sometimes at feeders, but just one to look out for. As you can see, this poor great tit's got these tumor-like growths above its eye, so it does unfortunately impair their eyesight sometimes, and some of the growths can be quite extreme. It's worth noting with avian pox that unlike trichomoniasis, which tends to be sadly fatal, avian pox birds can actually survive with it for quite a long time, or longer anyway. But it is one to look out for, because again, a bird with a tumor-like growth like this is more at risk from predation or not surviving for too long. So that wraps up the section about garden wildlife disease. I know it does sound a bit like doom and gloom, but there are definitely ways of preventing it from spreading. But it's a few species that have been affected that have been, the numbers have definitely dropped. So just one thing to look out for. And now I will move on. Now you'll be pleased to hear two slightly better tidings for certain species. So not all species have declined since Garden BirdWatch began. I'll go for a couple that have increased now, some of which are quite popular, some of them are less popular, I should say. So the nuthatch has actually increased by 6 places since Garden BirdWatch began. And what's been great about nuthatches increasing is that they've increased in gardens, and their range has actually increased, which means that they've started spreading further north through Britain. So they always used to be a species that was most common in southern and eastern England and parts of the West Country, but they're now moving through northern England and even into Scotland. So I was talking to a colleague the other day who lives near Stirling in central Scotland, and he actually gets nuthatches in his gardens most days. So they're a real success story, whether it's to do with the fact that we've had quite a few mild winters, that they've done well, but also they just seem to adapt well to gardens. So they're mainly a species you find around oak trees, but if you have peanuts in your peanut feeder in your garden and there are nuthatches in your area, definitely look out for them. So they're about great tit size and get onto feeders, can be quite dominant. and they always adapt this lovely pose. This is the nuthatch pose. This looks slightly strange. They tend to feed with their beak facing downwards rather than upwards, but it works for them. So definitely a species worth looking out for. I mean, sometimes they're more common in areas than others, but definitely one to look out for. And they just seem to be spreading into new areas, which is great because it's always nice to see a new species in the garden that's adapting well. And then in terms of nuthatches, here's the graphs again. So when you're most likely to see the highest counts of them towards the end of the year, the calendar year, September, October, December, the highest counts. But there is also a peak in May and June, just after the breeding season. But that's when you tend to see most nuthatches in gardens. It does vary, obviously, from year to year, but just to give an impression of when you're most likely to see them. Okay, so another species that's increased in gardens is the wood pigeon. So we know that people don't necessarily love wood pigeons. So why don't people necessarily love wood pigeons? Well, they look like they are quite big rotund birds that eat a lot. Well, they do eat a lot and they do look quite rotund, but it's worth noting that if you pick up a wood pigeon, they are mostly all feather. So there's quite a lot of feathers on a wood pigeon, but we're not gonna disagree that they do eat a lot. So they're not everybody's favorite garden bird. But what we found is the fact that the reason why they've increased 10 places in the Garden BirdWatch rankings in the last 25 years is just because they're so well adapted to gardens. So gardens provide for them a perfect area to feed, a perfect area to breed, and a perfect area to shelter. So that seems to be why wood pigeons have adapted to gardens so well and why their numbers have increased. So you tend to find with wood pigeons, they are seen in gardens most year round. But if I move on to the graph, there does tend to be a drop in wood pigeon numbers in the summer months, so between July and October. So that tends to be the time of year they'll start feeding in the surrounding fields on natural food, on grain and what have you. So that's when the numbers tend to drop to their lowest. But at this time of year, January and February, you get your highest numbers of wood pigeons. And especially at the moment, given we've got a lot of cold weather and snow, I suspect wood pigeon numbers are going to be quite high once we start analysing the Garden BirdWatch records from these next couple of months. So that's when you're most likely to see them, but just a very, very well adapted species to gardens, whether you love them or you don't love them. So another species gardens is the goldfinch, which has increased 12 places since Garden BirdWatch began. So it's actually the species that's increased the most in gardens rankings wise since Garden BirdWatch began. So goldfinch have actually shown a real reverse in fortunes in recent times, and gardens definitely seem to be a great place for them. So they're actually declining quite significantly in the 70s and 80s in some areas, but suddenly they started moving into gardens and you started using seed feeders. So they've got a very, very fine beak. So if you put out Niger seed or sunflower hearts in your garden, you may well get goldfinches feeding. So they love feeding on those kind of foods. And the more people started providing Niger seed, sunflower hearts, the more goldfinches were visiting gardens. And it's actually done the population of goldfinches a really lot of good. So since 1994, this species has actually increased by 147% breeding population wise. So that's a massive increase in goldfinch numbers. It mainly seems to be because so many of them are feeding in gardens and breeding well, and so really, really lovely. And of course, the thing about goldfinch is they're also very beautiful to look at, that lovely red face. And unfortunately, this picture does it disservice because you can't see the gold patches on the wings, but that's where it gets its name from. And they're a very popular garden bird. And just if you're into your collective nouns of birds and you don't know this one, the collective noun for a group of goldfinches is a charm of goldfinches, which I think is lovely. So definitely a success story, goldfinch in gardens. So we've been looking at data for this species recently, the last couple of weeks, and they have been slightly lower in gardens than 2019. We're looking into this, but not showing many signs of dropping as yet. But if you want to know when you're likely to see the highest count of goldfinch in your garden, so basically in the winter months, really, September through to March, so outside the breeding season, you see your highest counts, and then actually during the breeding season, April, May, June, you see lower counts. I mean, they're still present, and their recording rate will actually sometimes increase at that time of year, but actually in terms of counts in gardens, you tend to be a bit of a lull during the breeding season. But if you do have goldfinches in your garden, they're lovely to watch, so I hope you enjoy watching them. So moving on to just a few stats about garden birdwatch now, before I launch into talking about a couple of other species whose population has changed in a way since garden birdwatch began. So I thought I'd show you a few stats that pertain to the last 25 years in garden birdwatch that are quite impressive in my mind anyway. So I'm not going to read them all out, but there's a couple on here that I will. So the one that says most weekly submissions from one garden, 1,300. So what that means is that when these statistics were collated last year, so in February, March, April, one person that had been doing garden birdwatch since 1995 had submitted 1,300 weeks worth of garden bird counts to the survey in the last 25 years. So at the time that was being collated, there had been 1,304 recording weeks. So it turns out that this gentleman had only missed 4 weeks of submitting garden wildlife counts to GBW over the last 25 years. Now that's dedication. I think he deserved his holidays when he had his 4 weeks off over that time. So it just shows some of the very dedicated surveyors who have been taking part in garden birdwatch since the start, since 1995. And also, if you think you've got 1,300 weeks of data from your garden, you must have seen some real changes and certain species over the last 25 years. I think the gentleman in question lived in South Wales, and once he had a hawfinch in his garden, which was an absolute, must have been a treat from doing those counts all of those years, and you have one hawfinch 1 week. What a treat to see a species like that. And then the one at the bottom, so I thought I'd draw your attention to as well. Total number of individual birds and other animals counted by the survey, 194 million, which is a massive number. Don't expect you to remember that, but it just goes to show that 25 years of asking people to submit their bird and wildlife counts means we do get a lot of data from garden birdwatch and some incredible statistics. So moving on to the next slide like this, just to point out another few things. So the species with the most individual records was house sparrow, with 18 million individual birds recorded. So that's remarkable. I mean, sadly, house sparrow have declined in recent years in gardens. I'm not going to go into that too much tonight, but I mean, it is a sad fact that they're not as numerous as they used to be, but they are still the species with the most individual records in gardens. So the species found in most gardens was the blackbird on 8 million lists. So as most of you will know, if you watch your garden birds regularly, there's quite often a garden bird, but quite often a blackbird around in your garden or two. Although what we do find with blackbirds actually is that between August and October every year, blackbird numbers do drop in gardens because they tend to go out and feed in the surrounding countryside on natural food, and they also molt as well, so it can become quite inconspicuous. So that's known as the autumn trough of blackbird numbers. So, and then just one more stat I'm going to draw your attention to before I move on is this one: incidents of sick, injured or dead wildlife recorded, 160,000. So linking back briefly to what I was talking about earlier on about garden wildlife disease, is that there is now a direct link between garden birdwatch and the Garden Wildlife Health Project, which is a partnership project between RSPB, BTO, Frog Life and the Zoological Society for London. And that project is specifically aimed at monitoring garden wildlife health across Britain. So when people submit their garden birdwatch counts online now, they can actually say whether they saw a sick bird in their garden and fill the details in, and that gets sent directly to the Garden Wildlife Health Project. So it's providing a really fascinating insight, and important insight into where these diseases are occurring. So if you do sign up to GBW, or you do already, it's a great way of alerting scientists to where these diseases are. And of course, it's very important, as I said earlier on, and I won't talk more about it, but there is that link now that people can submit their data straight to Garden Wildlife Health, which is great. So what I'll do now is I'll move back to talk about a few other species that have their fortunes have changed in gardens, or slightly unusual birds in gardens, I guess. So one species that has done well in gardens is this one, the ringneck parakeet. So just in case you're not familiar with this species, nobody really knows where they came from, to be honest. They first appeared in the London area in Victorian times. Whether they escaped from somewhere, whether they were introduced, nobody really knows. Nobody's actually managed to track where they came from. But the fact is, they're here to stay now. And in certain parts of southeast England especially, they are very, very numerous. So in areas like London, Kent and Surrey, there are large numbers of ringneck parakeets. And so once the pandemic's over and you're able to go into London again to do a bit of sightseeing, if you find yourself at Hampton Court, London Zoo, Kew Gardens, somewhere like that, listen out for the squawking calls of ringneck parakeets, because there are quite a few of them in that area. So when the birds first appear in Britain, there was a bit of a concern that they wouldn't be able to survive. But actually, the native range of ringneck parakeet in Britain is in the world, I should say, is in the Himalayas. So they're really not bothered by cold weather at all. So if we do get some really cold weather later on in the week, the parakeet won't really be that bothered, because they're used to it where they're originally from. So there are a few concerns about ringneck parakeets, that they are out competing native species. So there's a lot of study going on at the moment, and there hasn't been any cast iron evidence to suggest they are definitely causing an impact, but it is one thing that's being looked into. So another thing to say about ringneck parakeets is that their range is actually spreading further north. So there are populations now in other parts of the country. So in the West Midlands, for example, in Greater Manchester, there are some in Hartlepool up on Teesside. So I suspect there are a few isolated populations in Yorkshire as well. So it's one species to look out for. And if you don't see them, you'll hear them. They've got a very loud squawking calls. And if you see them, they are a green parakeet with a pink beak. So they can be quite distinctive. So a species that has adapted well to gardens. So if you do have parakeets in your area, or if you have you been to somewhere where you've seen parakeets, you tend to get the highest counts towards the end of the calendar year, November and December. During the cold months, that's when you see the highest counts. And then throughout the year, it does fluctuate quite a lot, but it tends to be an autumn and winter species in highest numbers. So you may well start seeing parakeets in your area. It's a slightly interesting species. So moving on to another species that's slightly less gaudy looking, but very nice to see nonetheless. So this is a reed bunting. So just in case you're not familiar with reed bunting, so they're primarily a wetland bird. So as their name suggests, so they tend to nest in wetlands and actually areas of farmland now. So as a garden bird, their numbers tend to fluctuate, but they are mostly seen in gardens between February and April each year, because what tends to happen is that between February and April, the usual seeds they feed on in the countryside and the wetlands or in the farmland tends to become a bit scarce. So they actually start moving into gardens. So this is actually known as the hungry gap in garden bird numbers. So if you are going to get reed buntings in your garden, start looking out for them over the next couple of weeks and months, because that's when you're most likely to see them. So just to say that if you're wondering where my accent is originally from, so I'm actually from Poole in Dorset. So my parents live about 10-minute walk from an inlet of Poole Harbour where there are breeding reed buntings. And then every February they get reed buntings visiting their gardens, because they they come off the marshland and come and find bird feeders. So it's definitely the time to look out for reed buntings in your garden. So this is a nice male reed bunting with its black head and white collar. So females are quite brown and streaky. They can look quite sparrow-like, but they're a bit bigger, a bit chunkier. So definitely a species worth looking out for, especially if you live near water or a wetland where there are reed buntings. So just to highlight what I've been saying, so throughout most of the year, reed bunting numbers in gardens fairly low, but as I said, between February and April, most years it does vary. As you can see, the red and blue line numbers are slightly lower in recent years, but that's when you're going to see the reed buntings, and that seems to be why, is for the availability of food. And to a certain extent, it does also apply to yellowhammer as well. You will get yellowhammer visiting gardens during this time of year, especially if we get cold weather. So worth looking out for reed buntings and yellowhammers as well. And also tree sparrows, because I'm sure that some of you living in the area that you do are lucky enough to have tree sparrows in your garden. So we don't have that many in Norfolk where Rob and I are based, but if you do have tree sparrows in your garden, again, you're very, very lucky. I'm very jealous. So moving on. So talk about one more species before I start talking about something different. So the blackcap. So this is quite an interesting story. So so blackcaps are migratory birds. So just in case you're not familiar, so always used to be the case that blackcaps came to Britain for the summer from Southern Europe and Northern Africa and came here to breed. And then at the end of the breeding season, they would migrate south again for the winter, and we wouldn't see them again until next spring. But what seems to be happening now is that blackcaps are increasingly wintering in Britain as well. So in order to try and find out where these blackcaps have been coming from, BTO has done a lot of studies on blackcaps, so including putting little colour rings on their feet and fitting them with geolocators to find out where the birds that are wintering in Britain, where they're coming from, and whether they are the same birds that breed here. And there's been some really fascinating research about this. So until very recently, it was thought that most of the blackcaps that wintered here actually were birds that bred in Germany and the Czech Republic. So they were coming here because it's slightly warmer than where they bred. But a bit of research that was published at the end of last year actually showed something slightly different, that the birds that are wintering in Britain actually come from a line as far north as Poland and as far south as northern Spain. So if you think about it, you've got birds that are breeding here that winter in southern Spain and northern Africa. Then you've got birds that winter here that are coming from Germany, Poland, Spain, other parts of Central Europe as well. So it's really, really complicated migration, and through ringing and geolocator studies, that's how we managed to find that out. And the reason why blackcaps featured in this talk is actually the blackcaps that winter here are actually becoming quite well adapted to gardens and are becoming quite regular birds and visitors to gardens in some areas. It does vary according to your climate and where you are, but actually blackcaps are becoming a more familiar winter visitor to gardens. If you do have blackcaps in your garden, what you might discover about them is they are very, very territorial according to any other bird, feeders. So they will push off any other species in order to defend their food. So if you do have a wintering blackcap in your garden, it's probably quite bolshy and maybe shooing off the other birds in your garden, but it's what they do. They're quite a stocky bird, blackcap. So really interesting to see how they've adapted well to gardens. And just to highlight what I was saying about blackcaps in gardens over the course of the year. So during the breeding season and when the summer migrants are here, April to July, numbers in gardens fairly low, but actually you get your highest counts of blackcaps in gardens January, February, March, this time of year. And actually the last couple of weeks, we've had a lot of reports of people having blackcaps in their gardens. It does tend to be more a thing that happens in southern Britain, but they are wintering in gardens in quite a lot of areas. I had an email from somebody who lived in Edinburgh the other day who had a blackcap in their garden in the winter or in the last week. So they do occasionally winter in gardens in northern England and Scotland as well. So a really interesting species that's adapted to gardens very well. So talking now, changing pace a bit. So talking about gardens in and of themselves and how they benefit wildlife and how to attract certain species to gardens. So as I said at the start of the talk, gardens come in all sorts of different shapes and sizes, and not everybody's lucky to have a garden like the one that's pictured here. But whatever you can do for your garden wildlife is very, very appreciated. So if you're into wildlife gardening, there's lots and lots of different things that you can do to attract invertebrates and other species, birds and mammals. But then of course you can feed birds in your garden, but you don't have to feed the birds in your garden. Until recently, I actually didn't feed the birds in my garden. You did a tiny bit of wildlife friendly gardening in my own way to attract invertebrates in, and you can do what you will with your garden and it will be a home to something. So this next section, just talking about gardens and how they do benefit birds and other wildlife. So one way of attracting birds into your garden is to put nest boxes up. So actually this time of year is a great time to put nest boxes up in your garden because many resident birds are prospecting. So in this box here, have a juvenile blue tit. So if you do have a nest box that you want to put up and you're wondering which orientation to put it, it's best if you can to put it between north and east because it avoids the strongest sun from the south and the wettest weather from the west. So if you're going to put a nest box up in your garden, try and face it between north and east if you can. If you can't, then that's fair enough. But that tends to be the best orientation. And of course, you can get different nest boxes for different species. But that's just an example. As a blue tit one there, you can get sparrow terrace nest boxes and all sorts of different ones. Okay, and of course, you can feed garden birds. So I'm going to tell you a bit about different foods you can put out for garden birds to attract certain species. So if you put out seed feeders, you get a variety of different species visiting a garden, or you could do. So this is that's got sunflower hearts in it. So you've got a nice little gang of siskins feeding there. So lots of different finches will like feeding on seed siskins. If it depends where you are in the country, whether you get more siskins in your garden. But an interesting little thing about siskins that you may not know is they actually visit gardens regularly during wet and increment weather, because during wet and increment weather, the cones that they usually feed on, such as older cones, are closed. So it means they actually visit gardens more regularly when the weather's bad. So actually, if you get lots of rain, look out for siskins in your garden. You never know. So if you put out food like millet, so this fine seed, or in the feeder here, you might, if you're very lucky, attract bullfinches to your feeders. So bullfinches aren't necessarily a typical use of feeders, but they will do from time to time. And actually, tree sparrows will also like feeding on millet as well. So as I said earlier on, some of you may have tree sparrows on your feeders. If you do, you're very lucky. If you put peanuts out, you might attract a great spotted woodpecker or two. So blue tits and great tits will feed on peanuts, but great spotted woodpeckers especially love feeding on them, especially in June, because that tends to be when they start bringing their youngsters into gardens to teach them to use bird feeders. So this is a male great spotted woodpecker because it's got a red dot on the back of its head. The female doesn't have that dot. So if you want to attract woodpeckers in, that's a good way of doing it. So if you put out fat balls, you're going to attract a variety of different species. So fat balls are great because they're full of energy. They're very energy rich. So long-tailed tits love them, goldcrests love them, and actually blackcaps do love them as well. So always good to feed fat to birds in moderation, but especially at this time when it's really cold, it's well worth putting some fat balls out. I stocked up my fat ball feeder yesterday. It's been quite busy today with robins, dunnocks and blackbirds and the like, which has been nice to see while I've been having my tea breaks while I'm working at home. So bird tables are a good way of attracting birds in. So not all birds use bird feeders. Dunnocks will use bird feeders from time to time, but they do tend to use bird tables more regularly, and if they're not feeding on bird tables, they will be furtively wandering around on your grass or lawn, looking out for things that they can feed on. More of a ground feeder, but they will use bird tables as well. So if you put out windfall fruit, you might attract in a variety of thrush species. So here we have a nice male blackbird. So especially in the autumn, good to put out windfall fruit. So a quick tip about putting fruit out is that the softer and browner the fruit is, the more attractive that they are to birds. So if you want to attract blackbirds, redwing, fieldfare with apples, just put out the mankiest ones you have, because the birds will love them. The ones you don't want to eat, the birds will love, trust me. But anyway, so that's a great way of attracting thrush species. So you can feed hedgehogs in your garden as well. So there's a variety of hedgehogs, such as cat food and mealworms in moderation. There are a few things to avoid, such as milk isn't great for them. So it's a sad fact, really, that hedgehog numbers, they've declined by almost 2/3 in urban areas in the last 25 years. So whatever you can do to help hedgehogs is very, very beneficial and will help their population. So you can put a hibernation home out for them as well. And if you can also put little gaps in fences so they can move between gardens. There's several things you can do. And of course, in a couple of months' time, hopefully the hedgehogs will come out of hibernation, so you can start seeing them and hearing them snuffling around your garden again. Hopefully none of them will come out of hibernation at the moment, because it is way, way too cold for them. But a lovely addition to gardens, hedgehogs. And of course, very importantly, it's great to provide a fresh source of water for your garden birds for bathing and drinking purposes, because like us, birds always need to bathe and drink. Unlike us, they can't hop in the shower when it's cold outside. So if your bird bath does get iced up, it's very important to try and break the ice so the birds still have a place to bathe and drink. So not all birds prefer to bathe in water. Actually, house sparrows tend to bathe in dust more frequently, but they will bathe in water from time to time. But watching birds bathe is always great fun. So they're watching this lovely male blackbird, for example, here, having a quick bath is always nice to see. So very important to provide water for your garden birds, especially at the moment when it's cold. Okay, and then just very quickly is that we did a project with the BBC Springwatch team in 2019 is a nationwide audit of what gardens provide for wildlife. So, and one of the very interesting results was it provided a graph of ant distribution in gardens across Britain, and I thought I'd share it with you. That the areas that are shaded with yellow and brown, there were more ants in gardens. As you can see, there's a tendency towards southern Britain where it's slightly milder. But ants are, of course, a very, very important food source for a variety of birds, green woodpeckers, for example. So just to show you where there are more ants in gardens, something a bit different before I move on. So just quickly to talk about a couple of other of our surveys, and then I'll be coming towards the end of the talk. So another thing we look into is beak deformities in garden birds. So this is our Big Garden Beak Watch survey. So looks out for birds like this blackbird that's missing part of its upper mandible. Sadly, this does happen. Tends to be related to the amount of keratin in their beaks. So keratin is the same substance that your hair and nails are made out of. So, and they do manifest themselves in slightly strange ways. So you have blackbird like that, have a starling with an extra long beak, which is actually quite common. Got sent a picture of a bird like this just earlier on today. So sadly, they do have to adapt to feeding using their beaks like that. I'm pleased to say that most of them do actually manage to adapt quite well. And I've actually seen a video of a starling almost hovering like a hummingbird towards a feeder to feed with a really long beak like that. So they do tend to adapt quite well, but sadly you do get the odd extreme case like this poor rook that's got a crossed mandible. So for those of you who are familiar with crossbills, so a species of finch that has a crossed mandible to open fir cones, that's supposed to have a crossed mandible. Sadly, rooks are definitely not supposed to have a crossed mandible. And unfortunately, the consequences for this bird probably weren't that good. probably really struggle to find food. So something to look out for, beak deformities in garden birds, and you can report them to our Big Garden Beak Watch survey. And then another survey we run, the abnormal plumage survey. So looks out for abnormal plumage, as it says on the tin, so to speak. So looks out for birds like this blackbird, which has got a bit of white feathering on it. So it's important to point out before I move on that in order for a bird to be an albino, it has to be entirely white and have a pink eye. So, and actually true albino birds are really quite rare. So what we see more often are birds like this. So have a bit of white feathering, and this is what we know as leucism. So it's caused by a lack of melanin pigment in some of the bird's feathering, which actually means that they have a bit of white feathering where it should be black. So occasionally you'll get the odd bird, like a male blackbird that's entirely white, but it's still a male blackbird. And that's a varying degrees of leucism, so to speak. It's quite a complicated thing to go into. But this bird isn't a partial albino, it's leucistic. So that's the main point there. And just to show you a couple of other examples of birds with abnormal plumage. So we have a house sparrow. So it is a house sparrow, not another species, but it's got a white collar here and a white cap. So it just makes it look a bit different. And if you looked at it very quickly, you might even think it's one of the rare American sparrows that we don't tend to see here very often, but it is a house sparrow. I'm not going to say just a house sparrow, because house sparrows are very, very important birds in gardens, and we have to cherish the fact that we've got them because they're not as numerous as they used to be. And then just lastly, before I move on, you occasionally get the odd bird like this, which always causes a bit of an ID headache. So this bird is leucistic, as you can see, is actually a leucistic dunnock. So can it be quite difficult to identify these birds, and quite often Rob and I are to be found scratching our heads looking at pictures of these birds thinking, well, what species is that? So that's actually a leucistic dunnock. So just a case entirely white, but it has a normal coloured eye, importantly, so it's not an albino, it's leucistic. So a dunnock which looks a bit different, so to speak. So just in case you're wondering, the species that are most affected by abnormal plumage: blackbird, house sparrow and jackdaw, the top three, and a couple of other species in there. Quite a lot of species that show black feathers mainly, but house sparrow does seem to be affected quite regularly by leucism as well. So just a couple more slides and then I'll finish, because I realise that time is running short. So we also ran a tawny owl calling survey, which took place during the autumn and winter of 2018 to 2019 to monitor tawny owl numbers in gardens. So participants were encouraged to spend 20 minutes outside between dusk and midnight to listen out for tawny owls calling. And it was done during the autumn because that tends to be when tawny owls are the most vocal, because in October the adults tend to boot the youngsters out of their territory. So if you hear a lot of to-wit to-wooing, or the male singing to-woo and the male, female and juvenile responding to-wit, tends to happen mostly in October because it's the youngsters being told to sling their hook. And I'm not going to say anything ruder than that, so to speak. But the tawny owl calling survey provided us with some very interesting results. So it showed the tawny owl distribution in rural areas was actually quite good. In some urban areas, they were declining, and actually artificial lighting was having a bit of an issue, causing a bit of an issue for them, but not a major one. And it showed that you're most likely to hear tawny owls calling on a clear and fairly warm night, which may not seem like rocket science, but it does help to know when you're most likely to hear tawny owls calling in your area. So last but not least, I'm going to talk a tiny bit about our other wildlife records, just to show how we use them and what we find out. So here's a bit of a spring section to talk about butterflies. So hopefully in a couple of months' time we'll start seeing butterflies in our gardens. It's always nice to think about when it's really cold outside. So this is a brimstone butterfly, a species that overwinters as an adult and does start emerging from March onwards in an average year in southern Britain, and then a couple of weeks later as you get further north. Just thought I'd show you a bit of a comparison of data between 2018 and 2019. So if you cast your minds back to 2018, there was the beast from the east when we had the really cold weather and the snow. So shows the brimstone recording rate quite low until April, but actually then 2019, certainly in East Anglia where I live, it was actually quite very mild at the end of February, so about 24 degrees in some areas. And as you can see, the recording rate was a lot higher. So from February to compared to 2 years, so it just shows how the weather causes different species to emerge at different times. So a lot earlier emerging in 2019 than 2018, because of course if they emerge during heavy snow, they're not going to survive very long. And then another spring butterfly, just to show you a bit of more comparison data here, the holly blue. So again, just to highlight what I was saying, that holly blue in 2018, so after the beast from the east, quite low numbers until May, but then in 2019, when it was nice and warm in the early spring, they started increasing a lot earlier. And actually, it's funny enough, they actually dropped lower because I mean by July the holly blues had recovered somewhat. But it's just interesting to see by people providing us with data all year round how these species actually fluctuate, mainly because of the weather, but other factors. And then one last species to talk about before I finish, the painted lady butterfly, which is this species here. So it's a migratory species. So each year you get a different number of painted ladies visiting Britain, but every 10 years or so you get a big influx of painted ladies. So 2009, there was a big influx from Africa and the Middle East, and then 2019 again there was a big influx. So this shows their recording rate in gardens in August 2019 compared to so recording rate way up at 35%, and then August typically is about 5%. So during that massive influx of 2019, when some of you may have had them in your gardens, there was a big influx there. So just shows the difference. And then I thought I'd last show you how that data compares to what happened last year. So 2019, when we had a massive influx of painted ladies to gardens, relatively speaking. So big peak there, but then the red line shows 2020, which was a normal painted lady year. The count numbers were really quite low, and that's what you'd expect in a normal year, but just shows how eruptive the species are. And from people providing us with butterfly records, it's the kind of records we get. So if you wanted to take part in Garden Birdwatch, you can sign up by visiting bto.org/gbw. It's free to take part in the survey. You don't have to submit your counts every week, or you can submit them up to weekly, but you don't have to do it every week. So if you sign up, you can take part in the survey online. You get sent a free newsletter, an emailed newsletter that's written by Rob and myself, and various other regular communications. You can take part in the survey on the paper forms if you want to, if you don't want to do it online. But so that's a bit about Garden Birdwatch. So if anybody's got any questions, I hope hopefully myself and Rob would be able to share them, so answer them. So thank you very much for listening.
David, thank you for that. We have run over a bit, but there's not a part of it that I wish you'd left out. So thanks for covering such a wide thing. I was feeling a bit like it was a personalised presentation in the middle there. We've been here about 20 years in this house and just had our first male reed bunting in the garden, a winter blackcap last week, and sadly one case of avian pox, and I didn't know what that was until now, so I shall be cleaning the feeders tomorrow. So a few questions in, there's scope for a few more if people would like, but the first one in was to ask whether the average garden size has changed over the 25 years of the survey.
Yeah, I had a little look into this because I saw the question in the thing, so I saw a little research and see. I'm not able to say about the gardens that have taken part, but apparently garden size on average is smaller than it used to be. New developments trying to cram as many houses into small spaces. So we are seeing smaller gardens, but these aren't necessarily worse for wildlife. They can be better in some ways. You end up with more border habitat, which is often the best parts of gardens. A lot of the species we see in gardens are birds and animals that like edgeland habitat, somewhere between woodland and grassland, and that's tends to be where they do best. And gardens reflect that border habitat and kind of scrubland, these patches of open areas and shrubbery. So small gardens aren't necessarily a bad thing for wildlife. They may be for the people living in them, but it doesn't necessarily mean you'll be seeing a smaller diversity of species.
Okay, thanks for that, Rob. The second one is, could you just elaborate a bit on how stopping feeding stops the spread of disease? Don't the birds just move to another garden and take it there?
It's a complicated one. There is a chance that they will spend more time at other feeders, especially if they're very close by. So what we really want to do is get the message across that anyone that sees a sick bird on a bird feeder should be taking down the bird feeders and giving them a clean, taking them away for 2 or 3 weeks. If we know there's disease on a bird feeder, you should be taking it down, because that is a point of contact. And it's worth bearing in mind how a lot of birds aren't entirely reliant on our bird feeders, except at exceptional times of year. So what the birds will be doing is spending some time in more wild environments, finding that, and then popping to bird feeders, moving around, spreading diseases. What we're trying to do is limit the point of contact where they'll meet other colonies of birds. So greenfinches are going to hang around in small groups, and you may not necessarily have the same colony visiting the same garden in a day. So while it may have picked up trichomoniasis on another garden, if your garden is a point where they interact with other flocks, that could be a great way for it to spread further afield. So taking away that is definitely going to benefit birds in the longer term.
Okay, thank you. Are there species that rely almost totally on gardens, on us feeding them?
I'd say no. I'd say most often our gardens are a useful addition to a lot of birds' lives. This changes, especially at times like this where we've got heavy snow, cold weather. Gardens become a lot more important, and this is the time really when, if you're reluctant to feed normally, now's the time to do it, because this is when birds will be desperate for easily accessible food, lots of energy to keep warm. I'd say there's very few species that rely entirely on gardens. I mean, ringneck parakeet could make a good argument. You very rarely get them away from gardens, but obviously as a non-native species, the incentive to keep feeding them is minimal. And our wintering blackcap population is probably very heavily reliant on gardens. We know they're coming to us because we've got these garden feeders. They're finding more there than they would do in the wild. So our wintering population probably is quite reliant on them, but our summering population isn't at all. We don't see as many birds in the summertime.
Okay, thank you. Is the overall number of garden birds going up or down? And if so, whichever way, do we know why?
I don't have the answer to that one. I would suggest the populations are changing in the sense that we're seeing certain birds moving in, certain birds doing well. I'd say biomass wise, we're probably seeing the similar amount of birds coming into gardens as we used to. We've certainly seen diversity go up as people have fed more, getting more into bird feeding and putting out different bird seeds like niger seed and sunflower hearts. We've seen diversity go up and up every year. But the overall number, I think, there's so many species that have done poorly and so many that have done very well. It's a very difficult picture to say. I might be able to find that out on the average number of birds per garden, but I'd have to have a little look into our numbers and see what's going on with that.
It probably suggests there's not a strong trend either way, I guess, doesn't it?
No, not overall.
Shouting it the other way.
Yeah, we are. I mean, obviously, we're still very concerned about some species which are doing very poorly, especially, and there's some that seem to be doing worse in gardens than in more rural environments. Species like missel thrush used to be a lot more common in gardens, but we've seen those appearing fewer and fewer. This could be how we're managing gardens, fewer large trees. Maybe they're encountering things like slug pellets and pesticides more often. So we're looking into these things about why certain species are going, as opposed to the overall number.
Okay, thank you. And with an eye on the time, just the last one. Is it purely data that you collect, or do you collect people's stories of unusual garden bird behaviour?
Yeah, we get a lot of people emailing us in with interesting observations, and we do use those sometimes as a catalyst to look into something else. Quite often, not what we're looking in most often is numbers and populations and counts. However, these can be really useful to give an idea of what might be happening in gardens. Are birds using a different resource to what we normally expect? And we've seen that a lot from different people, and it can help guide our research. Give us more questions to answer.
Okay, thank you. That ends the interrogation. So I'll pass back to Helen to sum up. Thanks.
So thank you so much, David and Rob. That was absolutely fascinating talk, so informative. And as someone who's been doing Garden Birdwatch for quite a while now, it's great to hear what some of the findings have been overall over the last 25 years. I'm sure you will have rustled up tonight some more interest in the survey, and that people will be going online to join up. And I'm sure that I shall certainly be continuing to send my records in, because I've got my eye on that 1,300 weekly submissions record. I'm determined to beat it. So I'm going to be going for some years before I give it the chance to hold that record. Okay. So let me remind everybody that we'll meet again on the 23rd, I think it is, for a talk by George McGavin, which is going to be called Bugs Britannica. And I saw on the slides that were going around at the start that won't be on YouTube, that recording.
That's correct.
You have to be here.
Yeah, George is going to use some copyrighted material, so we can't record it and publish it. So yes, be here if you want to see it for that one.
Okay, so don't forget, otherwise you'll miss it. So thanks again, David and Rob, and very pleased you came.